So I thought it would be good just to set the scene and tell you a little bit about Windermere's history and water quality changes over time. A little bit about the Freshwater Biological Association first. So we were formed in 1929 with the aim of understanding and protecting freshwater environments around the world. We're advocates for the most vulnerable habitats on the planet, using our knowledge, data and skills to drive positive action for freshwater systems. And we do this through our science-based projects, species recovery programs, citizen science activities, training courses, knowledge exchange events and publications. We aim to inspire local and global action to protect freshwater systems using science. So the Freshwater Biological Association has been involved in research from its inception until the 1970s, when it moved towards practical solutions for management issues facing freshwater systems. The research covered all angles, from phytoplankton to macroinvertebrates to fish, focusing on their life histories, their behaviour, their abundance. We also looked at the physical and chemical aspects of the environment that these species occupied. So that it began with the trapping programme of pike and perch in 1941. We were one of the first organisations to collect and analyse sediment cores from the Lake District. In 1970, lung tubes were deployed for large-scale phytoplankton investigations, looked at salmon migration in the River Frome, and helped develop river packs, which is essentially a reference model against which monitoring data from rivers and streams are compared to assess water quality. In 2007, our Mussel Ark project began. So this is a captive breeding programme for endangered freshwater pearl mussel with the aim of reintroducing individuals into the wild and promoting species recovery. Then in 2016, the Riverfly project came to the FBA. So this is a national citizen science monitoring programme which uses macroinvertebrates to detect pollution incidents. That was basically the start of our growth of citizen science projects. And in 2022, our big Windermere survey began with Lancaster University, which Ben will tell you a bit more about. We also continue to monitor lake level, surface water temperature and rainfall at Mitchell-White Bay, where our Species Recovery Centre is, and test the water from Windermere that gets used in the Species Recovery Centre. But that's enough about us for this evening, so moving on to water quality. So all life is water-based. We wouldn't be able to survive without it. Water from freshwater systems supports drinking and irrigation, food production, power production, transport, livelihoods, recreation, as well as culture and aesthetic benefits, and is critical for human survival. It also supports a wide diversity of wildlife, each of which contribute to the functioning of that system and ultimately control what benefits we can derive from them. But human demand on all of our natural resources is growing, and so human activities and their byproducts can pollute water. So we can have things like water pollution, habitat degradation, climate change, and spread of invasive species and disease. And ultimately, the combined effect of all of these pollutants means that we can damage our freshwater systems, and those effects can be potentially irreversible. Lakes and rivers are especially vulnerable as they receive organic matter, waste, sediments, pollutants, and other contaminants from the wider catchment. So that's the wider landscape in which these water bodies sit and draw materials and water from. So we asked you to complete a short poll as people were coming in. What word would you use to describe Windermere? So I'll just bring up the results of that. 1 second. So there we go. So we can see that there's a mixture of words in there. Home surprisingly coming up the top one. I wasn't expecting that. I'm actually surprised to see that there's hardly any mention of sewage or phosphorus. That's very interesting. All of the words are actually quite positive associations with the lake. I'm noticing in particular breathtaking, iconic, and special. But I'm also seeing fragile in there as well, so clearly there are concerns about the lake. It'll be interesting to see how these views change or don't change after hearing the presentations tonight. And we'll also get you to take part in another short poll later in the evening to see what issues you would like to be addressed first on the lake. So moving on to Windermere and its history. So Windermere in its entirety has a surface area of 14 kilometres squared, catchment area of nearly 250 kilometres squared, volume of over 300 million metres cubed, and a maximum depth of 64 metres. It has two basins which each have distinct geological, hydrological, chemical and biological properties. They essentially function as two separate lakes almost. And it sits within the UNESCO Lake District World Heritage Site and within the Leven catchment. So this catchment also contains a number of other water bodies you might be familiar with, like Grasmere, Rydal Water, Elterwater, Esthwaite Water, Blelm Tarn, and a number of other smaller tarns. The main inflows to Windermere are the River Braithey and the River Rothay at the head of Windermere. Troutbeck drains the northeast side of the catchment, and Cunseybeck drains the Esthwaite Water subcatchment. The main outflow is the River Leven, which discharges into Morecambe Bay via a shared estuary with the River Crake, which is the outflow from Coniston Water. But the main message to take away from this figure is just that lakes can't be considered in isolation. We have to consider the catchment as a whole, as any activities within the catchment can influence the individual water bodies. Windermere has a bit of a reputation, so it is one of the world's lakes facing many issues in a complex social landscape. Records for the lake go back to the 1930s with establishment of long-term monitoring by the FBA and UKCEH, which you'll hear a bit more about. It's ecologically important for a number of reasons, but for example, it's one of the last refuges for Arctic char. It's also a major destination for tourism and recreation, which has really increased the profile of the lake. But with a higher profile comes more attention. So concerns have been raised about the lake, specifically around algal blooms and fecal material inputs. You might have heard that Windermere is ecologically dead. Well, that simply isn't true. So just even on the iNaturalist, which is a web and app for people to record their sightings when they're out and about, more than 70 vertebrate species, more than 100 insects, more than 200 plants, and more than 50 fungi species being recorded. And these are just the things that people can easily see while they're out and about. There's likely to be much, much more biodiversity there. So, for example, the FBA and UKCH have studied more than 100 phytoplankton species in the lake, and the benthic diversity is largely unknown because it's so difficult to study that part of the lake with its depth and size. But there's also a number of invasive plants like giant hogweed, New Zealand pygmyweed, Himalayan balsam, fish like roach and ruff, and birds such as Canada geese, which might be causing problems for water quality. So the sediment record of Windermere shows changes over the last 14,000 years, and human actions have been recognised for the last 5,000 years. So some major activities include deforestation, local mining activities, and urbanisation. So after the railway arrived in 1847, tourism grew and major settlements expanded. The latest estimate of tourist numbers was in 2019, with 7 million visitors to the Windermere catchment. So sewage was probably influencing water quality since the early 1700s, but piped water and sewers were introduced in 1870. Wastewater treatment works didn't become widespread across the UK until the early 1900s, when the first standards were introduced. So this is actually comparatively early. Agriculture has intensified over time, particularly with the move from arable farming to livestock production in the 18th and 19th centuries. So sewage treatment was pretty rudimentary until the first upgrade came in 1967, when secondary treatment was introduced to remove organic pollutants and fecal pathogens. But there was also a Sunday Times article around this time which warned of a eutrophication time bomb in Windermere, which was largely met with a lot of scepticism back then. Many properties in the Lake District aren't connected to mains drainage and still rely on septic tanks and private packaged treatment plants, and these require maintenance to keep them functioning properly. By the early 1990s, environmental monitoring showed that Windermere was becoming nutrient-enriched, so there were large phytoplankton populations, especially of cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. There was green filamentous algae growing on the rocks on the shoreline, and oxygen at depth was very depleted. So at the recommendation of the Institute of Freshwater Ecology, which was a forerunner of UKCEH, the local water company installed a more effective treatment to reduce phosphorus concentrations from the two major treatment works at Ambleside and Turlwood. But it's important to recognise all the other factors that were at play in influencing water quality over time. So fish farming played a role. It's actually the reason that Esthwaite Water is the most eutrophic lake in the Lake District. Climate change means that waters are warming up, which also depletes oxygen and has other knock-on effects for hydrological and biological processes. and more invasive non-native species are establishing themselves and becoming almost impossible to eradicate. And despite those improvements to wastewater treatment works, they can still be challenged by intense rainfall, population size, and the range of organic and synthetic compounds going down our drains today. Windermere is still highly affected by pollutants delivered from the surrounding lands due to the large catchment area combined with the heavy rainfall. So Windermere is still facing a number of complex and interacting pressures today, the main one being nutrient inputs. So phosphorus, nitrogen, silica and carbon, these are all nutrients which can influence how fast different types of algae grow and which types eventually form blooms. But it's important to recognise that not all blooms are toxic, and even the algae usually responsible for producing toxins aren't always doing that either. Nutrients can come from mains drainage, so your wastewater treatment works, storm overflows, but also non-mains drainage, septic tanks and private packaged treatment plants. Agricultural runoff, so fertilizers contain nutrients. Household products, and many detergents, cleaning products and soaps also contain forms of phosphorus, and potentially from the lake sediment as well, so nutrients that were deposited a very long time ago. Elevated levels of nutrients can influence the ecology and functioning of the lake, so with nutrient enrichment and climate change interacting, we'll see an increase in the frequency and intensity of algal blooms and associated deoxygenation at depth, which will have consequences for the health of humans, pets, livestock and wildlife. Fecal material inputs, so these come from mains and non-mains drainage, as well as agricultural runoff. Elevated levels of these can cause illness in animals as well as humans. And although the microbiological water quality at the 4 designated sites on Windermere has remained acceptable for several years, there's many fecal pathogens that aren't routinely assessed as part of that monitoring, and Dave will tell us a bit more about that later. Then there's land and water use change, so intensive historical land use, such as agriculture and forestry operations, is another source of sediment, nutrient and bacterial inputs, although the extent that land use affects water quality largely depends on how the catchment is managed. So some examples of land and water use changes include nitrate inputs from agricultural runoff over the last 50 years in both basins, loss of soil due to ploughing and overgrazing, water abstraction, extraction of soils and gravels, although that stopped in the 70s due to the impact on Arctic char spawning sites, commercial fisheries, so the impacts of overfishing on Arctic char became evident by the 19th century, so present day activities are largely restricted to angling and semi-commercial char fisheries. Then there's watercraft, so there's boats, kayaks, paddleboards, speedboats, what's the other ones I've forgotten? So I've forgotten the name at the moment, but yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So there's a number of those that have increased over time, and we've got, in 2000, the number of powered water vessels on Windermere was over 6,000 registered with the Lake District National Park Authority. And then we've also got wastewater, which we'll hear plenty about over the evening, but with the increased improvements in treatment and coordination of wastewater came reliance on Windermere as a diluting receptacle for that. Invasive non-native species, so these affect the ecology of the lake through competition with native species, altering food webs and introducing disease. So for example, roach and ruff can remove zooplankton, which are tiny animals which eat algae, meaning that algae populations have fewer predators and restrictions on their growth. There's also Canada geese, which could potentially be contributing nutrients through their feces and urine, altering vegetation and changing habitat suitability for other species. Invasive species tend to benefit from warmer temperatures brought on by climate change, allowing them to expand their range and move to deeper depths of the lake. So climate change, this affects the functioning of the lake directly through warming and weather patterns, but also indirectly by compounding other pressures like invasive species. Surface water temperature of the lake has increased over time, which Steve and Ellie will tell us a bit more about, altering the suitability of the lake for different animals and plants and favouring the formation of algal blooms. There's also increased intensity of rainfall events as a result of climate change, which accelerates the inwash of soil, nutrients and fecal bacteria from the wider catchment. So what's the current situation? Well, water bodies are currently assessed under the European Union Water Framework Directive, which includes a range of hydrological, chemical and biological criteria. The overall ecological status in 2022 was moderate, while both basins improved from moderate to good phosphorus. Bathing water quality at the 4 designated sites has remained at excellent status since 2018. So on the surface, things don't seem to be that bad, but I won't go into any more detail on this. I'll leave that to Dave. Heavy metal concentrations have decreased but can still exceed thresholds at local scale. And nutrient concentrations are being reduced, but potentially not far enough to counter the effects of climate change. So that reduction in phosphorus in the 90s by the wastewater treatment works did lead to a reduction in phosphorus concentration in phytoplankton chlorophyll A and an increase in the oxygen at depth. But that improvement hasn't been sustained over time. Climate change will keep shifting the baseline for restoration of the lake, and there could still be legacy levels of nutrients in the sediment that will influence inputs to water bodies for years to come. Concentrations of emerging pollutants could also be rising due to increases in population size, changing age profile, and pharmaceutical consumption. We'll hear a lot more tonight about what's going on in the catchment, but just to briefly summarise, we've got regulatory monitoring, inspections and enforcement, long-term monitoring, Farming and Protected Landscapes Programme through DEFRA and the Lake District National Park, United Utilities Investment Programme, citizen science, volunteer projects, advocacy and education work, and a number of on-the-ground delivery programmes through various organisations. But for any management and restoration of the lake, we have to consider the pressures jointly. We can't consider these in isolation, as that may not ensure improved water quality of the lake and the overall future. We need a comprehensive approach based on evidence. Improving ecological health will require nutrient inputs from different sources to be identified and reduced, so including agriculture, mains wastewater treatment, as well as non-mains wastewater. And we also need a better understanding of the impact of storm overflows during heavy rainfall and animal fecal waste in agricultural runoff in terms of nutrient inputs and human health. The wider community and local businesses can also make a difference, so through correct maintenance of septic tanks, correct disposal of waste and slurry, using low phosphorus cleaning products, correct use of fertilisers, and so on and so forth. So climate change, ongoing and expected effects in the future will continue to influence water quality and makes lakes more sensitive to this than they were in the past. So management and restoration is needed to maintain the status quo, but it also needs to go further than before, including addressing emerging issues. Long-term data on the lake's biology and water chemistry will be key to provide the evidence-based solutions to nutrient inputs, tourism and its impacts, and climate change and associated weather patterns. So take-home messages are that lakes are sensitive to multiple human pressures that operate at different scales in space and time. These often have interlinked and usually negative consequences for the ecosystem services that lakes provide. Like all lakes, Windermere has changed over time. It has become nutrient enriched, and that's been exacerbated by climate change and changing food webs. So we need more action to improve the health of the lake. It is one of the most studied lakes on the planet, but we still have a lot to learn about its water quality and the impacts on wild and human life. And this is especially true for human health and understanding impacts of pollution on the near shore, where people most often interact with the lake. So basically, we need a better scientific understanding of how Windermere will respond to future pressures in order to shape the solutions. If you've been interested in some of the topics that were covered during this presentation, then please visit our website where you can read our State of Windermere information note.